Thank you to the witnesses. Professor Farrar, you had a lot of statistics in your opening statement, and I'd like you to unpack the decline in successful prosecutions for tax evasion. You said in 2010, actually, I'm not sure if we know the number of convictions, but there were 2,300 charges laid, down to, it sounded like 43 in 2024. That's a shocking decline in the number of charges laid. Also, you said there were zero reported successful, or zero convictions reported. Last Wednesday, I asked officials how many there were in the most recent year of reporting, and they answered by saying there had been 14 over the last 5 years. So could you walk us through some of the numbers here and the decline in tax evasion prosecutions for offshore evaders, which was the point of my question on Wednesday?
Sure. So just to address your first comment, the study I did that I was referring to was a sample of all the media conviction notices. That was from 2006 through 2015. And my point was there in that 10-year window, there were zero convictions for offshore tax evasion. Now, I understand that since then there may have been a handful, but that was just a 10-year sample that I had access to. In terms of what I was referring to about the charges laid, in 2010, that was the first year I had data. I had found there was 2,397 charges for tax evasion in 2010, and that number had dropped precipitously to 43 in 2023 and 47 in 2024. And I was thinking that seems to be a fairly drastic decline, and I don't know the reason for that. But overall, in the over the 15 years that I have data for, you would see a very much of a downward trend in the number of overall charges that have been laid for tax evasion.
Okay, so the overall trend over 15 years is downward, quite shockingly, yes. It would seem. Is that because you think there are fewer offenses?
It's a hard question to answer why. I don't know the answer to that. It could be because the number of offenses are declining, but my sense is that if anything, they would be, if not increasing, at least stable. I just wonder how willing the CRA is to go after some of the, for lack of a better word, maybe the low-hanging fruit, like the everyday taxpayer, who would be engaging in activities that would not be subject to third-party reporting. For example, if you have like a chip wagon or something like that, the CRA tends not to go after the small fry, no pun intended.
But so if they're not going after either the small fry or laying or succeeding in prosecuting the large offenders, I mean, what is really going on here then? We assume that there is a tax gap and that taxes are evaded and that offshore havens are used in furtherance of that evasion, yet there appears to be minimal enforcement, at least as evidenced by criminal conviction or even charges in recent years.
Correct. And I would like to know from the CRA maybe the answer to your question, like why has there been such a drastic decline in the number of charges laid for tax evasion? Just from the data, it's very high level data, and I don't have access to the details about each of those charges, but just sort of a trend analysis. It would be concerning from an observer's perspective.
Okay. Now, this is concerning for you've given us a reason for concern here that hasn't come up in previous testimony. You referred to egregious avoidance. You used both the words egregious and aggressive, as well as evasion. And could you comment further on the impact that this has on compliance? So Canadians are willing to pay their taxes and understand that as a basic responsibility, but your research indicates that when taxpayers learn that wealthy, complicated, high-level of aggressive avoidance and evasion takes place, that has a negative impact on their willingness to comply.
Correct. What I've found is that the average taxpayer does not understand the difference between, say, aggressive tax avoidance using tax havens, which may, by the letter of the law, be technically legal, People tend not to perceive that as being legit, though. From their perspective, that is something that is perceived as morally wrong, which is tantamount to tax evasion. So from the perspective of an observer, it's the perception that I'm interested in. And the perception is that if someone is using a tax haven, that is going to be viewed as something that is dodgy, if not outright wrong.
Well, at a minimum, they would think that that's something unavailable to them as a less resourced tax filer.
Correct. Yeah, because you would have to be a fairly privileged taxpayer to be able to afford the services of a high-priced accountant or tax lawyer to set up some kind of offshore tax scheme.
Right, and so the end result, which was I think something you said you were concerned about, is how the prevalence of use of offshore tax havens impacts domestic tax compliance.
Correct. I'm concerned that.
Thank you, Thank you, Professor Farrar and Mr. Kelly.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to our witnesses. I will let Professor Lee catch her breath a little and address my questions to Professor Farrar. Thank you for being here. We know that the CRA budget has increased by 70% in the past 8 years under the Liberal government. We've had a reduction in recovery of funds. And you said, Professor Farrar, that this was of great concern. I'd like to know whether the CRA, in your opinion, investigates properly into tax evasion and does things in the proper way and at the right level.
Thank you for the question. It's a little bit of a hard question to answer. What I would say at the outset is I would expect, as I think you were implying, that there would be an increase in the number of charges laid if the budget to the CRA has increased. We would expect a positive correlation there. And if we found the opposite, that definitely raises some issues.
Professeur, c'est pas ça.
Professor, that's not where what I'm getting at. The budget already increased by 70% in the past 8 years, but we see that the results are on the decline. They're in free fall. Do you think they're efficient or effective right now?
If I had to answer that yes or no, I would say no. I don't know the exact reason why the number of charges is so low, but from a purely layperson's perspective, if I had this, because I don't know the internal workings of the CRA and how they allocate their audit resources, but from just an observer standpoint, if I'm looking back and thinking, why do we have this decrease in charges, yet the significant increase in funding? Something doesn't seem to add up here.
Et professeur, comment on pourrait rendre
Professor, how could we make the Tax Act in Canada clearer and more direct when it comes to tax avoidance? What could we do to improve it?
One thing that could be done is to simplify the tax system. I'm not the first person to suggest that, and by simplifying, I mean to maybe reduce the amount of language we have in the Income Tax Act. It's very immense. There's something like 1.3 million words. The average taxpayer is not going to have the time or effort to go through all 1.3 million words. Now, some of the legislation is very precise and very technical for very esoteric purposes, but for the average taxpayer, the language of tax is not very accessible. So trying to find a way to make the language a little bit easier to understand, I think, would go a long way to improving compliance.
toujours pour professeur Farrar,
For Professor Farrar again, the Prime Minister tried to defend the use of tax havens by Brookfield. He was one of the main leaders of the company. This is a method to make sure taxes are paid here in Canada. Do you agree with that statement by the Prime Minister?
I would say it's a little bit of a deceiving statement because it still involves the use of a tax haven. And if the Prime Minister has a vested interest in that a company, there seems to be a conflict of interest there. So I would be skeptical of those comments.
Merci. Je vais m'adresser.
Thank you. I'd now like to ask Professor Lee. Professor, earlier you said that there was ambiguity in the law. In your opinion, what are the deficiencies or weaknesses in the law right now?
Yeah, there are so many. Transfer pricing rules have been touched on. Our transfer pricing rules can benefit from reform and make them better aligned with the OECD guidelines. And the GAR has been improved, so I'm quite happy with the current state of the GAR legislation. How the Supreme Court of Canada is going to interpret it and apply it, especially in transactions and schemes involving offshore tax havens, however offshore tax havens is defined, is yet to be seen. And our tax incentive measure, the exemption system, I think also should benefit from a very careful systematic review, whether the tax subsidy actually brings about positive economic impact on the Canadian economy. So now the lines are drawn in a way that I don't think they serve the Canadian purpose. So by tightening up the exemption
Thank you,
system,
Professor
that will
Lee.
prevent
Merci,
it.
Monsieur Lefebvre.
Thank you, Mr. Lefebvre.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question is for Professor Lee. You've mentioned how complicated the tax code is, and you've tried to simplify it for us. And I think Mr. Farrar mentioned that there's about 1.3 million words even in the tax code. So when the tax code, when it's that complex, and it becomes a bit of a playground for the privileged, in the sense that you need to be highly knowledgeable or be able to afford to pay a professional that knows the code very well. It really becomes a bit. It rewards those that can afford to pay for the interpretation of the complexity of the current rules. Would you say that allowing those with resources to hide behind the complexity of the tax code actually disproportionately benefits those that have the resources, like the money to pay for those professionals?
Professor Lee? Is she frozen? I think she might be frozen.
Yeah. Oh.
Yeah. But it looks like we have...
Maybe Mr. Farrar.
You can turn to Mr. Farrar.
Well, I would rather Professor Lee answer that question, but I would if you wanted like a yes or no answer, I would say yes. It certainly is our privileged system. If you can afford a high-priced lawyer and a high-priced accountant to save you considerable sums in income taxes, why wouldn't you do that? Right? But then, of course, the general public is going to look at that as something that's unfair because it's very much of a class-based system.
Yep.
So we're just trying to get Professor Lee back, but she's not connected at the moment.
Okay. My next question was also for Professor Lee, but maybe let me just switch here to Mr. Farrar. Okay, so if corporations continue to be rewarded for not paying taxes in Canada, won't this issue just continue to get worse because there is no deterrence that you mentioned in your remarks?
Yes, I think it would only continue to get worse.
So what would you consider then an effective deterrence?
Well, if I could maybe indirectly answer that question, I think a possible solution would be to reduce corporate tax rates as well as personal tax rates, so that the incentive for using these offshore tax havens would be somewhat reduced or maybe significantly reduced. And the reason I say that is because it's very difficult for tax authorities, whether it's the CRA or elsewhere, to effectively enforce any kind of offshore tax scheme because the line between tax avoidance and tax evasion is not crystal clear. So if we can take away the incentives for using these offshore structures, I think we can solve the deterrence problem at the same time and maybe make things simpler.
Yeah, so I guess, do you believe that the CRA's enforcement capacity is adequate to deal with the complex international tax avoidance schemes that we currently see?
I would say probably not, given the fact that the number of charges seems to be relatively low, and the fact that the budget for international enforcement has increased. I don't think we're seeing it like a good bang for our buck.
Thank you for that. I guess Dr. Lee's not back here. Okay, so how effective do you think Canada's current legal framework is in addressing the aggressive tax avoidance through offshore tax havens?
I would say it's probably as effective as it's going to be. I can't see it really changing anytime soon. That's in part because the rules as we currently have them, they're a little bit antiquated, and case law has showed us that it's very difficult to achieve a clear-cut prosecution for anything that is aggressive tax avoidance, which borders on evasion.
Could you speak to the gaps in Canadian tax law that make it particularly vulnerable to, profit shifting or the use of tax havens?
Very briefly, please, Professor Farrar.
Very briefly, I would say, and this maybe piggybacks on Mr. Cochran's comment from the previous session, the changes to the general anti-avoidance rule, I think, would help with that. So I'm pleased to see that there are changes being made.
Thank you, Professor Farrar. So apologies to the committee. We are trying to get in touch with Professor Lee, but we haven't been able to yet. However, if Ms. Kobina, if you'd like to send in your questions in a written way, we can get a written response. And for other, Mr. Turnbull, because you're next.